I'd like to talk to you today about a place that I really love to visit. It's not that far away if you want to go visit yourself. It's kind of a preview of what we're going to be doing this week, preview of what's coming up through the end of the year, really. And I really hope we get to come back for a little bit this year because we're getting into the stuff that I'm really passionate about and I really love to share about. We're going to play a game this week. It's a simulation game from Mission US. You played one earlier in the fall about the Boston Massacre. This one's about the Underground Railroad, and it revolves around a town here in Ohio called Ripley. It's about, I don't know, an hour southeast of Cincinnati, right on the Ohio River, and Ripley was a true battleground almost every night. It's right on the Ohio River. You can see Kentucky and an old working plantation right across the river. And I want to introduce you to the town. I want to introduce you to some characters who will show up in your game as well and just give you a little background so you know what we're talking about. So first of all, as you're going to see in this other video that you watch for our quiz today, the Underground Railroad is not underground and it's not a railroad. It's a secret network to move freedom seekers. That's what we call them, people who are trying to escape slavery. We don't like to call them fugitive slaves. That has a negative connotation. So in 2020, the word we usually use is freedom seekers. These people who were enslaved, who didn't want to be enslaved anymore, who struck out mostly on their own, not knowing what was in front of them, and risking everything to try to get to freedom. And at one point, Ohio, crossing the Ohio River, getting into Ohio was freedom for a lot of people, a lot of those freedom seekers. And then in 1850, there was a passage of a law called the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act made it illegal to help someone run away. So this house you're looking at, we're going to talk a little bit more about it, belongs to a character from the story who's actually a real person. His name's John Rankin. John Rankin was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He helped people move through his house and further north to get away from people who were chasing him, called patrollers, or slave catchers are the ones who chase down those freedom seekers to try to get the reward money for returning them back home. And people like John Rankin, after the Fugitive Slave Act, were risking jail time, risking his house and his property. It could be taken away from him. And it just was really, really dangerous to try to help anyone try to run away on the Underground Railroad or escape slavery in any way. But there were hundreds of people who did that. Mostly, as you, again, listen to that other video that we have for this week, the YouTube video, it is really a credit to the people who were escaping themselves. They were freeing themselves. They just had some help along the way sometimes. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. A lot of them ran. They knew about places like Ripley, especially if they lived in Kentucky, and they knew that there were people here who would help. Some of them just made their way here on accident and had no idea what kind of help they were going to get. So let's look a little bit at Ripley. It's one of my favorite places to visit. This is a Ohio Historical Society site. You can go visit the John Rankin house and learn more about this on your own. So here's the riverfront of Ripley, and it looks a whole lot like it would have looked like even in the 1850s. Obviously, these roads weren't paved. There weren't electric streetlights and this nice iron fencing. It was just a city right up to the riverbank. And this is called, I believe, Water Street. And some of these houses, most of these houses that you can see in this picture, are houses that were there in the 1850s. And they have a nice little brochure. You can take a walking tour, and it will tell you who owned these houses during that time period right before the Civil War. It will tell you whether they were people who helped those freedom seekers or people who tried to capture those freedom seekers. And all night long through Ripley, there were those patrolmen, those slave catchers, who would patrol up and down this street looking for people trying to make their way across the river from Kentucky, which is over here, all the way across to Ohio, into the town of Ripley. And at the time, Ripley and Cincinnati were about the same size. So another character you're going to meet is a guy named John Parker. This is John Parker's house. And when I took the picture before that looks down the street at Ripley today, I was standing in the same spot. I just turned so that you could see John Parker's house. So John Parker lived right on Water Street, right on the riverfront, and he could look out his windows and see Kentucky and see a working slave plantation. John Parker, who's also in the game you're going to play, was an enslaved man. He had been enslaved in the South. He learned a trade. He learned how to make metal. He had his own foundry right here, and he did a lot of metal work and had a lot of inventions. Eventually, he earned enough money working after he had done work for the old lady who owned him, who claimed ownership of him in the South. She let him keep money. And for $1,500, he bought his freedom. He moved to Ripley. And what he did things a lot like Harriet Tubman in that other video I keep talking about. They talk about Harriet Tubman, and the guy calls her an abductor on the Underground Railroad, meaning she went back into the South. She met people, she grabbed people, and she would take them to freedom. She led them to freedom. That's what John Parker would do as well. He would work in his foundry all day, and at night, he would row a boat across the river, go out into Kentucky, and find people who he had either heard were trying to be free, or even sometimes people who had never even mentioned that they wanted to be free. John Parker would say, "You've got 30 seconds to pack your stuff and come with me. I'll take you across the river, and I can make you free." But everybody was on to John Parker, and he had a really conspicuous house, and it was easy to watch. The other place that people would go was John Rankin's house, that house from the first picture. And it's up here on the hill. He and his many, many sons, I think something like 11 or 12, they were armed to get up to their house. It was a really steep hill. They would shoot at those slave catchers, those patrolmen, and they would help people go through their house and move on along the Underground Railroad. But this was almost a nightly occurrence in Ripley. You have this battle between people like John Parker and John Rankin who are trying to help fugitives run away, and you have those patrolmen who are trying to catch them. This is the John Rankin house. You'll see the view in a little bit that you get from John Rankin's front door. You can see Kentucky. You can see down across the river. And for a lot of those freedom seekers, they were running and they had people on their tails right behind them. And people always knew to come to the Rankin house because there were lights in the window. And if they were coming across that river, people would tell them, "Get to the house on the hill." Rankin would leave his door unlocked. There was a back door straight through the house, and he built it that way on purpose. And sometimes he'd go to bed with bags of food and bags of clothing laying out. And in the morning, he would wake up, and that would be gone because people would run through. Now, these stairs are known as the Stairway to Heaven. In a lot of enslaved people's lingo, Underground Railroad lingo, heaven meant freedom. And these were the last stairs that people would see before they would go through John Rankin's front door. So these stairs quickly got the nickname, the Stairway to Heaven, long before Led Zeppelin made that song I just played for you. And so, like I said, these people would sometimes be running here. Rankin wouldn't know they were coming. They would go in the front door. They would grab the bag of food and clothes that were out on the table, go out the back door, wouldn't even wake the Rankins up. They'd put 7 or 8 bags out a night. Sometimes they would wake up and they'd all be gone. Sometimes none of them would be gone. Sometimes people contacted the Rankins and let them know that people were coming so they could be prepared. That's when he and his sons would arm themselves. So let's look at this view that they have. This is just a reverse view of what we were just looking at. It's Kentucky out here across the river. That's a working plantation there you can see, or used to be a working plantation that you can see. John Parker's house is down here just off the screen, and there's the Ohio River. So you can imagine if somebody were coming across that at night, even with a half moon, you could see that for a long way. And I have a life lesson for you too. You can also hear across water really well. So if you're ever out on the water or boating with your friends and you're talking about one of your friends who's far away from you, you may think you're whispering, but your sound is going to carry. I've known a lot of friendships who have ended that way because people think that their friends can't hear them when they're talking behind their back, but they're talking on water, and they absolutely can. So John Rankin and his family, they'd take turns sleeping, and they could watch and see. So when they saw movement on the river, they could see, I believe, a total of 7 miles along the river from the top of their hill here. They could see people coming across, and they would know to be ready most of the time. But those freedom seekers, not only would they have to get across the river, they'd have to get through the town of Ripley down here. And remember, some were helpful, some were not. And they would try to make their way up to the stairway to heaven and make it to the Rankin house. The Rankins, as far as we know, never had a single person that they helped through their house get captured and retaken back into slavery. It does happen. It happened to a lot of people. But as far as we know, the Rankins were really, really successful at getting people out of their house. They were never caught in their house. John Parker, too, never caught in John Parker's house. So let me add a little bit more to this. The Rankins were friends with a family from Cincinnati called the Stowe family, Stowe. Reverend Stowe ran a seminary in Cincinnati, and he lived there with his family, including his daughter named Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is famous for writing a book. And when Abraham Lincoln met her, he said, "Oh, so you're the little lady who wrote the book that started this big war." She wrote a book about Uncle Tom, who was an enslaved man, and how he was a really good soul, and yet he was not treated very well his entire life. It was a book that was written for an audience of Northern, mostly women, to try to get them to sympathize with the plight of people who were enslaved. Most people in the North could ignore slavery because it didn't have anything to do with them. They knew about it. They thought it was terrible, perhaps, but they weren't going to politically get involved to try to stop it. The stories that Harriet Beecher Stowe told in Uncle Tom's Cabin about Uncle Tom and about a woman named Eliza, they stirred the hearts of Northerners against slavery. And it exploded the abolition movement leading up to the Civil War. It really divided the North and South even more than they already were. Well, a lot of the stories she put in Uncle Tom's Cabin, we later find out, she learned from John Rankin right here in this house that overlooks the river, like you see. And one of the most famous stories is a story of Eliza, an enslaved woman, a freedom seeker, who was running away with her baby. And that was almost never, ever, ever successful. Babies slow you down. Babies make noise. Most people who run with their babies get caught. And it turns out it's a true story. Her story is a little different from the true story. I think the true story is better. In Eliza's story, in Harriet Beecher Stowe's story, Eliza is jumping on floating blocks of ice. It's the wintertime. And she jumps from block to block until she makes it across the river. And it's very dramatic. And it really gets your heart racing. But the true story, I think, is even better. As Eliza was running, she was exhausted. And she got to a house somewhere here on the other side of the river from Ripley. And she stopped at a cabin. She took a chance. And she went into the cabin of this man, knocked on the door. He invited her in. He gave her some food. She had no idea what he would do, whether he'd try to return her, whether he would try to help her. It turns out he wasn't really opposed to slavery, but he felt sympathy for Eliza. But he talked to her and told her how much better it might be if she just turned around and went back. If she could make it back before daylight, nobody had to get hurt. And he had convinced her not to go any further, that the river was too dangerous and that it would be much better if she just turned around and went back to where she had run away from. And then she heard the dogs barking, the hounds that were chasing her down. And she realized she could never live that way anymore, and that she couldn't let her baby grow up in a place like that. And she said, "I'm going to run." Well, the man knew that the ice across the river was really thin. What was eventually going to happen, she was going to hit a thin spot. She would fall through, and the current of the river would pull her and the baby down the river, and they were going to drown. So he took a rail off the top of his rail fence, and he gave it to her and told her, "When you fall, make sure you hold on to this." And so she took off across the river. And by holding that rail, she fell through the ice, but the rail, it didn't break all of the ice. The rail held her up, and she could crawl back out of the hole that she had created. And she scooted her baby forward on the ice. She crawls out of that hole and she picks up that rail and she picks up her baby and she starts running again. And she fell through the ice again. And it was just a repeat of this over and over and over again, with hounds on her tail, people coming after her with guns, people coming after her with dogs, trying to take her back to where she had run away from. I think she fell through somewhere between 11 and 15 times on her way across the river. And you can see here, as you look at the river, how easy it would be to see somebody trying to do that. And I told you that the sound carries really well across water, how easy it would be to hear every time she broke through that ice in the middle of the night and would get up and grab that baby and grab that rail and go again. And if you remember, all along that riverfront, there were patrolmen, slave catchers. She finally made it all the way across the river and she collapsed, exhausted, on the Ohio side. She wasn't safe yet. There were still people chasing her. And as she looks up, there was a man standing over the top of her. She had no idea who this man was. This man reached out, gave her his hand, helped her up, and said, "Little lady, anybody who works that hard for their freedom has earned it. You need to get to that house on the hill." And he helped her up to the Rankin house. That man who helped her was one of the most ruthless, meanest slave catchers in Ripley, in southern Ohio. And he was so moved by her effort with her baby and her desire to be free that he didn't collect the bounty. He helped her make it up to the top of this hill, to the house, the Rankin house in Ripley, Ohio. So you're going to see a lot of this stuff as we move forward this week, as we move forward for the rest of this year. These are going to be familiar names, familiar faces, familiar sights as we go forward. Have a good day. Have a good week. Stay safe. Talk to you later.